Imagine, if you will, a view from very far above, so far that the curve of the earth begins to show itself at the edges of your vision. You are suspended in the darkness of space, looking down at our world rotating slowly beneath you, and your gaze settles on a place of immense emptiness and quiet. A desert stretches for thousands of miles in every direction, a landscape of red and gold and endless dunes, a place so vast that human concerns seem impossibly small. But as you drift lower, closer to the surface, something catches your eye. There, emerging from the monotony of sand and rock, is a shape, perfectly circular, impossibly precise, with rings within rings like the ripples when a stone is dropped into perfectly still water. This is not a natural accident of wind and time. This structure is too deliberate, too measured, too intentional. You are looking at the Richat Structure, the Eye of the Sahara, and you are beginning to look at something that has haunted human imagination for more than 2,000 years. The Richat Structure sits in the nation of Mauritania, in Western Africa, and it measures approximately 25 miles across, 40 kilometers of concentric rings of stone and mineral, each one distinct in color and composition from the others. From high above, from the vantage point of an astronaut orbiting Earth, the rings appear with such clarity that one might believe them to be human-made, might imagine them to be the work of some ancient architect who possessed knowledge and vision that exceeds our own understanding. The structure rises and falls, the rings marked by ridges and depressions, by variations in rock type that scientists have spent decades attempting to explain. Each ring tells a story written in stone, a geological narrative that spans millions of years of planetary transformation. And yet, when you look at this structure, when you truly look at it with your mind open to possibility, you cannot help but notice how profoundly it resembles something described in the words of a Greek philosopher more than 2,000 years ago, a man who may have been preserving a memory of something real, something that existed in the ancient world before it was lost forever. Now we must travel backward through time, must leave the quiet of the modern world and the vast emptiness of the Sahara Desert, and move instead toward the city of Athens, Greece, in the year 360 before the Common Era. This was the height of classical antiquity, when philosophy was beginning to take shape as a discipline, when thinking men gathered in the agora to discuss the nature of reality and the mysteries of existence. In this Athens, in a modest room where papyrus scrolls were arranged on wooden shelves, and the sound of the city beyond penetrated only faintly through thick walls, a man named Plato was writing. His hand moved across papyrus with careful deliberation, his stylus forming letters that would be copied and recopied for millennia, that would influence the trajectory of Western thought for more than 2,000 years. He was composing dialogues, conversations between his teacher Socrates and other speakers, and in two of these dialogues, called Timaeus and Critias, he was recording a story that had been transmitted to him through a chain of remarkable individuals across time and distance. The story began, according to Plato, not with him at all, but with his ancestor Solon, who lived more than a century before Plato's own birth. Solon had travelled to Egypt in his youth, and while he was there visiting the sacred temple precinct at Sais, he spoke with Egyptian priests who possessed libraries of knowledge stretching back across centuries. These priests, learned men who guarded the wisdom of their people, told Solon of a civilization that had existed in antiquity, a civilization so powerful, so advanced in its knowledge and capabilities that it had become proud and arrogant. This civilization had attempted to conquer the known world, but the gods, offended by such hubris, had decided to bring about its destruction. In a single day and a single night of misfortune, the story said, this entire civilization had vanished into the earth and the sea, sinking beneath the waves as if the gods themselves had pulled it down with invisible hands. The name of this civilization was Atlantis, and the priest said it had been a real place, a verifiable historical fact, though one that had been lost to the passing of ages. Plato described this civilization in words that seem almost mathematical in their precision. Atlantis, he wrote, was organized as a series of concentric rings. The city itself was circular, with rings of water alternating with rings of land, each one built within the other like the rings of a target. At the very center was a temple to the goddess Poseidon, and surrounding this temple were the administrative structures and the homes of the powerful. The outermost rings contained the houses of ordinary people, and beyond that were the harbours where ships from across the known world would dock. The civilization was immensely wealthy, with abundant supplies of metals and precious materials, with access to fertile lands that produced crops in abundance, and with a military force so powerful that no nation dared to challenge it. The inhabitants of Atlantis possessed advanced knowledge. They understood architecture and engineering. They built structures that impressed even the gods, and they created a society of such refinement that it seemed to represent the peak of human achievement and capability. According to Plato's account, Atlantis was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules. This phrase would echo through history and shape the understanding of the world for thousands of years to come. The Pillars of Hercules, Plato meant, were the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage of water between southern Spain and northern Africa that separates the Mediterranean Sea from the broader Atlantic Ocean. Everything beyond these pillars, to the west, was thought to be open ocean, uncharted and largely unknown to the ancient world. For centuries, this description seemed to place Atlantis somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, perhaps on an island that had since sunk beneath the waves, or perhaps in waters so distant that no one had been able to find it. Countless theories emerged, each one placing Atlantis in some distant location, off the coast of Spain, near the Azores, perhaps even across the Atlantic in the Americas. Explorers and dreamers sought for it, and the failure to find it led many to conclude that Atlantis had been merely a philosophical allegory, a story Plato invented to make a point about the rise and fall of civilizations, not a record of something that had actually occurred. The ocean became the default answer, the assumed location, the place where Atlantis must be if it existed at all. And yet the ocean gave up no secrets, no ruins, no artifacts that could confirm the tale. The search became futile, and over time, as centuries passed and no evidence emerged, the story of Atlantis retreated into the realm of myth and legend, a beautiful tale but not a historical fact. It seemed that Plato's account would remain forever unverified, a puzzle without a solution, a mystery locked away from human understanding. And yet there was a problem with this conclusion, a flaw in the logic that no one seemed to notice. If Atlantis had never existed, if Plato had invented the entire story as a philosophical exercise, why had he included such specific details? Why had he been so precise about measurements and distances and geographical features? Would a purely fictional allegory require such exactitude? Would an invented civilization need to match actual geography so closely? These questions lingered in the minds of thoughtful observers, creating a persistent doubt about the received wisdom. But what if the interpretation was wrong? What if beyond the Pillars of Hercules did not mean to the west, but rather meant something else entirely? What if it meant southward, toward the interior of Africa, toward a place that the ancient Greeks barely understood and knew only from the reports of traders and travellers? What if Atlantis was not hidden beneath the Atlantic Ocean, not lost to distant waters, but rather hidden in a place of such emptiness and such harshness that it had simply been overlooked, swallowed not by water but by sand, transformed not by drowning but by the slow creep of a desert that gradually consumed everything in its path? These are the questions that modern researchers have begun to ask, and the more carefully they examine the evidence, both Plato's written words and the geological reality of our modern world, the more compelling the case becomes that the answer has been sitting in front of us all along, visible from space, waiting to be recognized. The Pillars of Hercules, after all, marked the boundary of the known Mediterranean world, the limit of established navigation and trade routes. Everything beyond them was foreign, distant, other. And in the minds of ancient Greeks, this could have included not only the open Atlantic but also the mysterious African continent, a place that was known to exist, but that remained largely unexplored and poorly understood. The interior of Africa, the vast Sahara Desert that dominated that continent, would have been even more remote and legendary than the Atlantic Ocean. Perhaps even more significantly, the Pillars of Hercules marked not just a geographical boundary, but a symbolic one. They represented the edge of civilization, the boundary between the known and the unknown. Anything beyond them existed in a kind of mythological space, where historical facts blended with legend and speculation. In such a context, it becomes easier to imagine that an ancient Greek historian like Plato might have heard accounts of a civilization in Africa, a place that had flourished before the desert consumed it, and that he recorded these accounts in his dialogues with the understanding that they referred to a place that was beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the symbolic sense, beyond the reach of the established Greek world, in a realm of mystery and antiquity. Consider the precision of Plato's description, detail by detail, the careful specificity of a man who was either recording actual information or creating an extraordinarily elaborate fiction. He described Atlantis as being circular, and the Richat structure is perfectly circular, visible as a target with concentric rings when viewed from above, a geometry so precise that it seems to demand explanation. He described it as having rings of water alternating with rings of land, and the Richat structure possesses rings of different rock types, different mineral compositions, creating distinct boundaries between each ring, as though they were created by some intentional process or by geological forces that operated with remarkable regularity. He described the civilization as being wealthy in certain materials, bronze and a mysterious metal called orichalcum that was harder than anything but gold, and the Richat structure contains multiple layers of different mineral deposits, including rich veins of copper and other valuable resources that would have made it enormously valuable to an ancient civilization. He described the city as having an opening to the south, a channel that led toward the sea and mountainous terrain to the north. And this is precisely the geography of the Richat structure, with mountains rising to the north in the form of ancient uplifted ridge systems, and an opening to the south that would have once led toward the ocean when the climate was different and the land was different. He described specific measurements, speaking of distances in stadia, an ancient unit of measurement, and when researchers convert these measurements and apply them to the Richat structure, the correspondence is so close that it seems impossible to dismiss as mere coincidence, impossible to attribute to chance or to luck. The colours that Plato mentioned also seem to align with what geologists have observed at the Richat structure. He described the city as being built in rings of different colours, red, white, and black, creating a visual appearance that was distinctive and recognisable. And indeed, when satellite images capture the Richat structure, the rings display exactly these colours: red rocks, white mineral deposits, dark stone, arranged in concentric patterns that create precisely the visual effect that Plato described. The precision of these correspondences is such that one begins to feel the weight of accumulated evidence, the sense that perhaps we're not looking at coincidence but rather at memory, at an account that has been transmitted across centuries and that contains genuine historical information embedded within it. Plato also specified the distance from Atlantis to the sea. He said that the city was 127 stadia from the ocean, approximately 23 kilometers using modern measurement systems. And here we arrive at another remarkable correspondence. For the Richat structure lies approximately 23 kilometers from where the ancient coastline of Africa would have been, during a period in the distant past when the climate was dramatically different from what it is today. The more one examines these details, the more one is drawn to the possibility that Plato was not describing a fiction, but recording a fragment of history, a memory of something that had actually occurred, something that had been sufficiently remarkable and sufficiently cataclysmic that it had been preserved in the collective memory of people for thousands of years, passed down through stories and recorded in the documents of ancient priests. When Solon heard this account from the priests at Sais, he had heard it with the understanding that it was genuine history, not allegory or invented narrative. And when Plato received the story from Solon's accounts generations later, he recorded it with the same reverence for historical truth. The fact that this account had been maintained in the minds and memories of Egyptian priests, a people known for their careful preservation of historical records and their meticulous documentation of events, lends a particular weight to the narrative. It suggests that somewhere in the past something real had occurred, something notable enough to be remembered by the learned people of Egypt and transmitted across generations. The story itself asserts its own authenticity, claiming to be not a mere fable or moral lesson, but a record of actual historical events. And as we shall see, when we examine the geological and archaeological evidence of our modern world, this claim begins to seem far less implausible than it once appeared to be. If you're using this video to help yourself fall asleep, that is precisely the reason these videos exist. To offer your mind something to contemplate that is both engaging and soothing, something true and factual that allows your consciousness to drift gently as you learn. The story of Atlantis, whether it proves to be factual or metaphorical, carries within it a truth about the fragility of human civilization and the power of nature to reshape the world according to its own rhythms. If you have found the Calm Archive helpful, consider subscribing to the channel so that you receive new videos as they are released into the world. And if you're comfortable doing so, leave a comment below letting me know where you are in the world and what time it is where you are when you are watching this video. I genuinely enjoy reading these comments, finding out that there are people from every continent, every time zone, settling down with these stories of history and mystery as they prepare for sleep. The diversity of viewers, the sense of a global community united in the quiet hours of the night, is something deeply meaningful to contemplate. Knowing that someone in Tokyo and someone in London and someone in Sao Paulo are all watching the same video at different times, all thinking about the same ancient mysteries, creates a kind of invisible connection across the surface of the earth. It reminds us that we are all part of something larger than ourselves, all inheritors of the same history, all seeking to understand the stories that shaped our world. Anyway, let us return now to the question that draws us deeper into this investigation. What was this place that Plato described with such precision? What was the Richat Structure before it became the Eye of the Sahara? Before the desert claimed it and transformed it into the isolated landmark we see from space today? The answer lies in understanding the nature of the land itself, in recognizing that the world we see today is not the world that has always existed, and that profound transformations are possible across the span of human history. Civilizations can rise and fall, landscapes can be completely remade, and vast fertile regions can become empty desert within the span of a few thousand years, which is, in the grand scale of geological time, merely a moment, a breath, an instant. The story of the Richat Structure's discovery is itself a remarkable tale, one that connects the distant past with the modern world through the perspective of space travel and technological advancement. In the year 1965, astronauts aboard the Gemini spacecraft were orbiting above the Earth, circling the planet at tremendous speed, and looking down upon the surface of the world from a vantage point that no human had ever occupied before. These were the early days of space exploration, an era when the view from orbit was still fresh and astonishing, when the curved horizon of Earth and the vast empty spaces beyond still carried a sense of wonder and majesty. Being in space, looking down at your world from such an altitude, fundamentally changes one's perspective. The nations and boundaries that seem so important at ground level disappear entirely from view. The petty concerns of daily life become invisible. Only the great features of the landscape remain visible. The massive mountain ranges, the broad river systems, the vast deserts, the oceans. The consciousness of an astronaut is transported to a different scale of awareness, a larger framework of understanding. As the Gemini astronauts look down at the deserts and oceans and continents scrolling beneath them, they notice something unusual in the landscape below. A circular feature in the Sahara Desert in Mauritania, a perfect target of concentric rings set against the chaotic patterns of sand and rock. This feature, which would come to be called the Richat Structure, or the Eye of the Sahara, appeared from space to be so geometrically perfect, so deliberately arranged, that one might be forgiven for assuming it to be an artifact of human construction, perhaps an ancient monument, perhaps a structure built for some unknown purpose by people who possessed knowledge and capabilities beyond what we associate with ancient cultures. The astronauts reported what they had seen, and the discovery was recorded and documented, eventually becoming a topic of scientific interest and geological investigation. It is a strange and perhaps meaningful coincidence that the astronauts who first spotted the Richat Structure from space were looking at it with the eyes of explorers, with the perspective of people venturing into unknown territory. Plato's Atlantis, after all, was a voyage of discovery in the imaginative sense. It was a story about exploring and understanding the ancient world, about piecing together fragments of history to understand what had come before. The astronauts, looking down from the heavens at this strange circular formation, were themselves engaged in a form of discovery that paralleled in spirit the philosophical investigations of ancient thinkers. From the ground, the Richat Structure is less immediately impressive, though no less remarkable in its way. It measures approximately 40 kilometers in diameter, about 25 miles, making it visible from high altitudes but not particularly obvious when standing at ground level. If you were to stand at the edge of the structure and look toward the center, you would see the landscape rising and falling in gentle waves, the terrain creating subtle hills and valleys that mark the transitions between different rings. The structure consists of a series of concentric rings of stone and mineral, each ring distinct in color and composition from its neighbors. The outermost rings appear to be primarily composed of sedimentary rock, with bands of different types of stone creating clear visual boundaries that are evident even to the untrained eye. As one moves toward the center, the rock types change in a predictable and orderly fashion, revealing different geological layers and mineral compositions that tell a story of the Earth's history, a narrative written in stone that geologists have spent decades attempting to decipher. The changes from one ring to the next are not random, but appear to follow patterns, as though some organizing principle had arranged the rocks in their current configuration. The colors of the rings vary dramatically in ways that catch the light differently, depending on the time of day and the angle of the sun. Some rings are reddish in tone, colored by iron minerals that have oxidized over millions of years, the iron in the rocks reacting with oxygen to create the deep rust colors that are so characteristic of desert landscapes. Other rings are lighter in color, gray or white or cream-colored, composed of limestone or other light-colored minerals that reflect the sun's light. Some rings appear almost black, composed of dark basalt and other volcanic or dark igneous rocks. These different colors create a striking visual effect, particularly when viewed from above, making the structure stand out dramatically against the surrounding desert landscape, a tapestry of different hues arranged in perfect concentric circles. The initial geological hypothesis, when the Richat structure was first studied seriously, was that it must be a meteor impact crater. This seemed like the most obvious explanation, a circular feature of this size and precision, with concentric rings radiating outward from a central point, resembled the impact craters that scientists knew from studying other planets and moons. If a massive meteor had struck the Earth at this location, the impact would have created a circular depression surrounded by concentric rings of uplifted material, precisely the kind of structure that was visible at the Richat location. However, as geologists began to examine the site more carefully, they found a significant problem with this hypothesis. There was no central impact basin, no crater floor that would have been created by the meteor's impact. There was no evidence of the kind of melting and shock metamorphism, the dramatic alteration of rock caused by the extreme heat and pressure of a meteor impact, that should have been present if a massive collision had actually occurred. The rocks at the site showed no signs of having been subjected to the kind of extreme temperatures and pressures that would be characteristic of an impact event. This discovery was puzzling and somewhat frustrating to geologists, because the structure was so perfect in its concentric geometry that it demanded an explanation. Yet the most obvious explanation did not fit the evidence. Over time, as more detailed geological surveys were conducted, and as scientists examined the rock types and mineral compositions more carefully, a new hypothesis emerged. The Richat structure, geologists concluded, was likely the result of a deeply eroded geological dome, a formation that occurred when the Earth's crust, forced upward by internal geological processes beneath the surface, created a dome or bulge in the landscape. The forces that created this uplifting are related to the same tectonic movements that shape entire continents, that create mountain ranges and modify coastlines. Over millions of years, erosion by wind and water had worn away the outer layers of this dome, stripping away rock layer by layer, exposing the concentric rings of different rock types that lay beneath the surface. Each ring represented a different layer of the Earth's geology, each one composed of rock that was formed under different conditions, at different times in Earth's history, and each one exposed as the erosion progressed inward toward the center. The process of erosion is patient and relentless. It does not work quickly by the standards of human time, but over millions of years it accomplishes extraordinary transformations. Wind-blown sand, acting like an abrasive, gradually wears away the softer rock layers. Rain, whenever it falls on the desert, carves channels and gullies, removing material grain by grain. The freeze-thaw cycle, where water seeps into cracks in the rock and then freezes and thaws repeatedly, gradually breaks the rock apart. Over eons, these processes working together have shaped the landscape into its current configuration. This explanation made more geological sense, and it fit better with the evidence that scientists could observe. However, even this explanation has gaps and uncertainties, and many geologists acknowledge that the precise mechanisms by which the Richat structure formed are not fully understood. The structure remains something of a geological mystery, a formation whose origins and exact processes of creation are not entirely clear, not completely resolved. The Richat structure is in this way like many features of the natural world. It is real, it is measurable, it is observable, but its ultimate origins and the exact processes that created it remain somewhat shrouded in mystery. This uncertainty is, in a sense, fitting. The Richat structure is mysterious in its appearance, mysterious in its origins, and mysterious in the light it may shed on ancient human history and the existence of civilizations long lost to time. But the geological questions fade into the background when one begins to examine the correspondence between the Richat structure and Plato's description of Atlantis. The matches are so numerous and so precise that they cannot be easily dismissed as coincidence. They suggest instead a pattern, an alignment of specific details that points towards something real. The structure is circular, as Atlantis was described to be circular. It possesses concentric rings, exactly as Plato described the city being organized into rings of water and land, with each ring separated from the others by clear boundaries. The measurements that Plato provided when converted to modern units and applied to the Richat structure align remarkably closely with the actual dimensions of the site, a correspondence that would be extremely unlikely if Plato were simply inventing details. Plato said that Atlantis was surrounded by mountains to the north, and the Richat structure does indeed have ancient mountain ranges to the north, forming a dramatic backdrop to the central rings, creating the geographic barrier that Plato described. Plato described an opening to the south, a passage or channel that led toward the sea, and the Richat structure has precisely this geography, with its rings opening toward the south in the direction where the ancient ocean would have lain during periods when the climate was wetter and the sea level was higher. These are not vague similarities, but specific, measurable correspondences that suggest Plato had access to actual information about this place, or that the place he was describing actually existed and was remarkable enough to be remembered and recorded. The colours that Plato mentioned, red, white, and black, are exactly the colours visible in the Richat structure when viewed from above or in satellite imagery, a correspondence so striking that it arrests the attention and demands explanation. The red comes from oxidized iron minerals in certain rock layers, minerals that have been transformed by their exposure to oxygen and the elements over millions of years. The white comes from limestone and other light-coloured minerals in other layers, materials that were deposited when the region may have been covered by ancient seas or when different geological processes were at work. The black comes from dark stone and basalt in still other layers, volcanic materials that testify to the region's complex geological history. These colours are not scattered randomly throughout the rock, but are arranged in distinct bands in the very rings that Plato described in his account of Atlantis, a pattern so organised that it suggests intentional arrangement, or at least the operation of forces that worked in a highly ordered manner. It is as though someone had read Plato's account and then used it as a blueprint to paint the landscape, creating a perfect physical representation of his words, except that the painting occurred over millions of years of geological time, long before Plato was even born, long before Plato wrote his words down on papyrus, or alternatively, it is as though Plato had access to information about this actual place, had received accounts or descriptions from reliable sources who had seen it or knew of its existence, and had recorded that information in his dialogues with precision and care, preserving details that would ultimately allow future generations to recognize the location he was describing. The distance from Atlantis to the sea, as Plato specified it, was 127 stadia. The stadion was a unit of measurement used in ancient times, a standard measurement that varied slightly depending on the region and the era, but roughly equivalent to 600 feet or about 185 meters in modern terms. Different cultures use slightly different stadium measurements, but Plato was working with the Athenian standard of his time. 127 stadia, by this reckoning, would equal approximately 23 kilometers, or roughly 14 miles. And here we encounter another striking correspondence, another alignment of specific details that seems too precise to be mere chance. The Richat structure is located approximately 23 kilometers from where the ancient coastline of Mauritania would have been during a period in the distant past when the climate of North Africa was very different from what it is today. This distance is not approximate or vague, but measurably close to Plato's specification, close enough that if an ancient people had inhabited the region around the Richat structure, they would indeed have been separated from the ocean by roughly the distance that Plato mentioned. The precision of this measurement is extraordinary and demands attention. It suggests that either Plato had remarkably accurate information about the location in question, obtained perhaps from Egyptian priests who had preserved detailed records, or that he was describing something that was real, and that had been measured carefully and preserved by the people who originally recorded it. The probability that all of these correspondences could occur by chance. The circular shape, the concentric rings, the colours, the specific distance from the sea, the mountains to the north, the opening to the south, is vanishingly small, so small as to be statistically negligible. The accumulation of these matches, each one independently striking but together, forming a pattern of such coherence and specificity, points towards something real, something that actually existed in the ancient world, something that Plato was describing with actual knowledge rather than pure imagination or fabrication. The desert's silence wraps around the Richat Structure like a blanket, a quietness so profound that it seems to contain within it the memory of ages, the echo of ancient voices and ancient civilizations. When one stands in the Sahara, one is aware of the immensity of time and the smallness of human endeavour in comparison to geological processes. The rocks beneath your feet have been shaped and reshaped by countless processes, by ancient seas that covered the land and then retreated as the climate changed, by wind and erosion and the slow grinding of geological time, by the patient work of natural forces that operate according to their own timescales. The vastness of the landscape, the endless horizons that seem to stretch to infinity, the apparent emptiness and barrenness, these things induce in the human mind a sense of peace and humility, a recognition that our individual concerns are small and temporary compared to the great slow movements of the earth. Standing in such a place, one understands that the human world, with all of its drama and conflict and meaning, exists on a timescale that is almost infinitesimally brief compared to the geological timescales by which the earth operates. The rocks you are looking at may be millions of years old. The processes that shaped them operated over time spans so vast that they dwarf human history entirely. Yet here in the Sahara, in the midst of this apparent barrenness, there may once have been life and culture and civilization. The Richat Structure, visible from space as a perfect eye looking up at the heavens, seems to hold a secret, a memory of something that once flourished in this now desolate land. It is as though the structure is waiting to be understood, waiting for someone to look at it with fresh eyes and see what it's trying to tell us. The story it tells is not one of human triumph, but of human vulnerability. The story of a civilization that rose to great heights of knowledge and achievement, only to be overwhelmed by forces greater than itself, to be buried not in the ash of volcanic eruption or the rubble of war, but in the slow encroachment of a changing climate, in the gradual transformation of a fertile region into an inhospitable desert. The Sahara has not always been a desert, and it will not always be a desert. The Earth's climate is not stable but constantly changing, and these changes occur across timescales that human civilization can measure and understand. The drying of the Sahara, if indeed the Richat Structure was once the location of a thriving civilization, would have been a gradual process. Not a sudden catastrophe as Plato described, but perhaps a process that occurred over centuries or even millennia, as the rains became less frequent and the vegetation became more sparse, and the rivers that once flowed through the region began to dry up. Imagine living through such a change, witnessing the slow transformation of your world, watching as the lakes and rivers that sustained your civilization began to shrink, as the grasslands gradually turned to desert, as the climate shifted and the world you knew became uninhabitable. This is the story that the Richat Structure may be telling. Not the story of a single catastrophic event, but the story of a slow and inexorable transformation, a tragedy of environmental change playing out across centuries. Imagine, if you will, a landscape that is nearly the opposite of what exists there today, the Sahara Desert, that vast expanse of sand and rock and emptiness that dominates so much of the African continent, was not always empty. The climate of our planet has shifted many times throughout its history, guided by cycles and forces that operated over timescales that are difficult for the human mind to fully comprehend. One of these great climate shifts created a remarkable period in Africa's past, a golden age, a period when the Sahara was green, when grass and shrubs covered the land in abundance, when water flowed freely and the region supported vast populations of both animals and humans. This period, known to scientists as the African Humid Period, lasted roughly from 11,000 years before the present day to about 5,000 years before the present day, a span of 6,000 years during which the Sahara was a very different place, a landscape transformed by rainfall and fertility. 6,000 years is a very long time on the scale of human history. It encompasses the rise and fall of multiple distinct civilizations, the development of writing and recorded history, the construction of monuments and structures that still stand today. Yet on the geological timescale, on the timescale by which the Earth measures its age and history, 6,000 years is brief and fleeting, a moment in the long history of the planet, and yet in that moment, in that window of time when the climate was different and the land was different, a thriving civilization could have flourished and developed to remarkable heights. The evidence for the African humid period is not merely theoretical speculation, but is based on solid physical evidence that scientists have observed and measured and verified through multiple independent methods. Satellite imagery taken from space looking down at the surface of the Earth shows the remnants of ancient river systems that once flowed through what is now the heart of the Sahara Desert. These rivers, called wadis by the Arabic-speaking peoples of the region, left traces of their passage carved into the landscape, channels and gullies carved into the rock by the patient work of flowing water, dried riverbeds that can still be seen from above and traced across the landscape like the veins in a leaf. These ancient rivers did not flow into nothing but were part of a complex system of water distribution that channeled rainfall into larger systems, that was fed by heavier rainfall during the African humid period when the monsoon patterns that bring moisture to Africa extended farther north than they do today. The existence of these ancient watercourses can be verified through multiple independent lines of evidence that corroborate each other and support the conclusion that a wetter climate once prevailed in the Sahara region. When scientists examine the ground around these wadis, using drilling and excavation techniques, they find sediments and geological deposits that could only have been created by flowing water, materials that would not exist if the region had always been as dry as it is today. They find evidence of erosion patterns consistent with water action over sustained periods, not the kind of erosion that might be caused by occasional floods, but the kind of systematic carving that results from years and years of regular water flow. They find archaeological artifacts at the sites where these rivers once flowed, the remains of human habitation and activity, suggesting that ancient peoples lived near these water sources just as modern humans naturally tend to live near rivers today, clustering settlements in places where water is available. The physical landscape itself testifies to a wetter past. The shape of gullies and valleys and riverbeds can be read like a book by those trained in geological interpretation, each feature telling a story about water and weather and ancient climate patterns. Beyond the wadis, there is abundant evidence of vast lakes that once existed in the Sahara region. The most remarkable and significant of these was Lake Mega-Chad, an enormous freshwater sea that once covered an area as vast as the Caspian Sea or the Great Lakes of North America, one of the largest inland bodies of water on the modern Earth. Lake Mega-Chad did not exist in the Sahara Desert exactly as we know it today. It was located to the south and east of where the Richat Structure stands, in what is now central Western Africa. However, it would have been an accessible destination for people living at the Richat Structure, reachable by travel through the wet grasslands and along river systems. It would have been a primary source of fresh water and fish and other water-dependent resources. Imagine living near the Richat Structure during the African humid period and having access to such vast quantities of fresh water, to the fish and aquatic animals that inhabited those waters, to the land animals that came to drink at the lakes and rivers, attracted by the abundance of water. The Richat Structure, in such a landscape, would not have been a desolate and isolated formation standing alone in an empty desert, but rather a notable and valuable geographical feature in a living, thriving landscape filled with life and possibility. The evidence for this wet climate is not merely geological, but also archaeological and biological, coming from multiple sources that all point toward the same conclusion. Scientists have found ancient rock art in the regions of the Sahara, paintings and drawings and engravings created on the walls of caves and overhangs, and these images tell a story of a landscape that was dramatically different from the modern Sahara. At Tassili Nadja, a plateau region in the central Sahara that has been designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, archaeologists have discovered paintings of people swimming, of herds of cattle and giraffes, of hippos and elephants and other large animals that cannot possibly survive in the modern Sahara Desert, but which clearly flourished during the African humid period. These paintings, created with pigments derived from natural materials by people who lived in the region thousands of years ago, are a visual record of a wet Sahara. Tangible proof that the climate was once very different from what it is today. The paintings show people hunting large game animals, cultivating crops, and living a settled agricultural lifestyle, the scenes and activities of a productive society. They show people in boats, on rivers and lakes, paddling across water, suggesting that water transportation was common and practical, that water was an abundant resource. They show the abundance and diversity of life that characterized the region during this wetter period. Not just the dramatic large animals, but also the smaller creatures, the birds and fish and insects that would have populated such a landscape. These paintings are not flights of imagination or allegorical representations, but records of observed reality, visual documentation of the actual world that surrounded the artist who created them. They stand as testimony to a period in the Earth's history when the Sahara supported life in abundance, when vast herds of animals roamed across grasslands, when rivers flowed with water and lakes shimmered in the sun, when the region was alive with activity and possibility. The transition from the wet Sahara to the dry Sahara was not instantaneous and cataclysmic, but occurred gradually over centuries and centuries, a slow transformation that would have been barely perceptible to those living through it day by day. As the climate shifted, driven by orbital changes and other planetary factors, the rainfall that had been reliable during the African humid period began to become less frequent. The rains that had fallen during most of the year began to occur only during certain seasons, then only during certain years, then only sporadically. The vegetation that depended on regular rainfall began to change in response to these altered conditions. The dense forest gave way to grasslands, and the grasslands gradually became thinner and more sparse, with woody shrubs replacing the grasses. The rivers that had flowed year-round began to flow only during the rainy season, then only sporadically when rainfall was heavy, then not at all. The lakes that had covered thousands of square kilometres began to shrink in response to decreased rainfall and increased evaporation, their surfaces receding year by year, their shores retreating as the water level dropped. This process would have been extraordinarily difficult and heartbreaking to witness if one were actually present to observe it, to see the landscape of one's birth and childhood gradually becoming foreign and hostile, to watch as the abundant resources that had sustained your civilization began to disappear, to experience the slow and growing realization that your traditional way of life was no longer sustainable in the region where you and your ancestors had lived for generations. Such a transformation would have exerted immense pressure on any civilization that existed in the region, forcing them to confront difficult decisions. People would have needed to adapt to new conditions or to migrate, to find new lands or to develop new ways of living. Some might have moved southward, toward regions that retained more moisture and more regular rainfall. Others might have moved toward the coasts, trying to maintain access to water and marine resources as the interior gradually dried out. Some might have simply remained in their homeland, adapting as best they could to increasingly harsh conditions, until finally the region became completely uninhabitable, and they too were forced to leave or perish. The gradual drying of the Sahara is a process that would have taken generations to play out, centuries perhaps, a transformation that would unfold across multiple human lifetimes. But from the perspective of individuals living through it, from the viewpoint of people watching their world slowly change around them, it would have seemed like a tragedy of immense proportions. Now consider the timeline that Plato provided in his account. He said that Atlantis had been destroyed approximately 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt, and Solon lived around the year 640 BCE, which would place the destruction of Atlantis around the year 9640 BCE. This date places the fall of Atlantis squarely within the African humid period, at a time when the Sahara was still wet and green. More specifically, this date is near the end of the African humid period, during a time when the climate was beginning to shift, when the rains were becoming less reliable, when the first signs of desiccation were becoming apparent. If Atlantis was indeed located at the Richat Structure, it would have been a civilization that rose to prominence during the height of the wet Sahara, when water was abundant and the land was fertile, and then fell into decline as the climate changed and the region dried out. The destruction that Plato described, in a single day and a night of misfortune, might be understood not as a sudden cataclysmic event, but as the culmination of a longer process of decline. Perhaps the fall of Atlantis was not a physical catastrophe, but a slow deterioration that finally became irreversible, forcing the civilization to abandon the region, or to gradually fade away as its resources dwindled and its ability to sustain a complex society declined. The Richat Structure would have been an ideal location for a civilization during the African humid period. Its position at an elevation provided a defensible settlement site, and the concentric rings would have provided natural barriers and structured spaces for habitation. Access to the nearby Lake Megachad or to the Wadis that flowed through the region would have provided ample water and the ability to irrigate crops. The mineral wealth of the region, evident in the different rock layers that comprise the rings, would have provided resources for tools and construction. The grasslands of the surrounding savanna would have supported herds of cattle and other domesticated animals. The location was rich, strategic, and defensible, exactly the kind of location where a sophisticated civilization might develop. Ancient peoples were not less capable than modern people. They were simply working with different technologies and different knowledge bases. A civilization that existed at the Richat Structure during the African humid period could have accomplished remarkable things, building structures, organizing trade networks, developing systems of governance and belief, creating art and literature and knowledge. They could have become wealthy and powerful, commanding resources and respect. And then, as the climate changed, that power would have begun to wane. The resources that had been abundant would have become scarce. The lands that had been fertile would have become marginal. The civilization that had once seemed invincible would have found itself struggling to survive in a landscape that was becoming progressively more hostile. The fate of Atlantis, if it was indeed located at the Richat Structure, would therefore have been not a sudden destruction, but a slow fade, a gradual retreat before advancing aridity, a disappearance into history, as the people who had built it were forced to abandon it and seek new homes. Within a few centuries, the region would have become completely inhospitable, the desert expanding to cover what had once been productive land. The monuments that had been built, if any had been constructed, would have been buried by wind-blown sand, or left standing as mysterious ruins in an empty landscape. The knowledge and achievements of the civilization would have persisted only in the memories of its people and their descendants, transmitted through stories and oral traditions, eventually reaching the ears of the Egyptian priests who recorded it, eventually reaching Plato, eventually reaching us through the written word. This is perhaps the greatest tragedy that can befall a civilization, not to be conquered or destroyed in war, but to be slowly consumed by the changing environment, to be erased not by human enemies, but by the gradual transformation of the world itself. And yet it is a fate that has befallen many civilizations throughout human history. The Nabateans flourished in the deserts of the Middle East, building cities and controlling trade routes, until climate change and the shifting of trade patterns caused their civilization to decline and eventually disappear, leaving behind ruins in the desert. The mound builders of North America constructed elaborate cities in the Mississippi Valley, and then, over the course of several centuries, abandoned them as environmental and social conditions changed. Civilizations rise and fall, and often the factors that cause their decline are environmental rather than military or political. The Green Sahara, as scientists call the African humid period, represents not merely a climatic phenomenon, but a window into what the world was like before the Sahara became the vast empty desert that we know today. During this period, the region was vibrant and alive, supporting large populations of humans and animals, hosting thriving civilizations. The evidence for this period is abundant and clear. In the rock paintings at Tassili Naja, in the ancient riverbeds visible from satellite imagery, in the archaeological remains of settlements and cities that flourished during this time. The Richat Structure, as a geographical feature, would have been even more prominent during this period. It would have stood as a notable landmark in an inhabited landscape, perhaps serving as a centre of settlement or as a sacred site, or simply as a distinctive geographical feature around which people organised their knowledge of their world. The story of Atlantis, understood in this context, becomes not a tale of an island civilization in some distant ocean, but a story of a real place that existed in Africa, that rose to prominence when the climate was favourable, and that declined and was abandoned as the climate changed. The precision of Plato's description, the circular shape, the concentric rings, the colours, the distance from the sea, the mountains to the north, suggests that he was describing real geographical knowledge, real information about a real place. And the timing suggested by his account, approximately 9,000 years before his own era, places this civilization squarely within the African humid period, at a time when such a civilization could have flourished. To contemplate the Green Sahara is to contemplate the power of climate and environment to shape human civilization. It is to recognize that the stable, predictable climate that we have enjoyed for the past 10,000 years has enabled the rise of complex civilizations, written language, science, and art. It is also to recognize that the climate is not stable, but constantly changing, and that environmental change can dramatically impact human societies. The drying of the Sahara did not happen overnight but occurred gradually, over centuries, allowing human societies time to adapt and migrate. Yet even with that time, it was still a process of loss of homes, loss of agricultural lands, loss of ways of life that had been sustained for generations. The people who lived through this transition must have experienced it as a kind of tragedy, as the world they knew slowly slipping away from them. As you drift towards sleep contemplating these thoughts of ancient climates and lost civilizations, of the Richat Structure standing in its rings of red and white and black stone in the midst of the desert, consider the transience of all human endeavour. The monuments we build, the civilizations we construct, the knowledge we accumulate, all of these are ultimately at the mercy of larger environmental and historical forces. Yet the impulse to create, to build, to remember, to pass on knowledge to future generations, this impulse is as fundamental to human nature as breathing. The people of Atlantis, if they lived at the Richat Structure, felt this impulse. They built and created and recorded their knowledge, and fragments of what they created reached across thousands of years to be recorded by Plato and to reach us today. In this way, they live on in memory, in story, in the physical evidence preserved in the landscape, and the Richat Structure, with its perfect concentric rings visible from space, remains a monument to their possible existence, a mystery waiting to be solved, a testimony to the power of the human mind to preserve and transmit knowledge across vast spans of time. In Plato's account, there exists a passage that has echoed through 24 centuries, a phrase so simple in its language yet so devastating in its implication. Atlantis, the philosopher wrote, was destroyed in a single day and night of misfortune. The great island civilization he described sank beneath the waves suddenly, completely, as though the earth itself had decided to erase what humanity had built upon it. What forces could be so powerful, so absolute, as to consume an entire society in such swift completeness? Plato spoke of earthquakes that split the land, floods that rose without mercy, a cataclysm so total that it left no survivors to tell the world what had been lost. For centuries, scholars dismissed this as mythology, mere philosophical allegory crafted for the sake of instruction. But what if Plato, though he may have embellished the details, was describing something that actually occurred? What if, beneath the poetic language, he was preserving a distant memory of a real catastrophe? There exists a period in Earth's history, one now firmly documented in geological records and ice cores and sediment layers, when such a catastrophe truly did strike. The Younger Dryas period, a time when the Earth itself seemed to reverse course, when warmth gave way to bitter cold, when the entire climate system shifted within the space of a few human lifetimes. This was approximately 12,800 to 11,600 years before the present day, a period that emerged with startling abruptness after the Earth had been warming steadily for nearly 1,000 years. It was as though the planet had made a decision, had turned away from the path toward a temperate world and chosen instead to plunge back into Ice Age conditions. Rivers of ice that had been retreating returned and advanced. Temperatures dropped by as much as 20 degrees in some regions within decades, a change so rapid that plants could not adapt, animals could not migrate fast enough, and human populations faced starvation and displacement on a scale almost unimaginable. The North Atlantic became roiled with icebergs. The sky grew darker as less sunlight penetrated the atmosphere. The great ice sheets that covered the northern continents, which had seemed destined to continue their slow retreat, suddenly held their ground and even began to grow. What triggered such a sudden reversal? The dominant theory in recent years, one that has gradually gained acceptance among paleoclimatologists and physicists, proposes something cataclysmic, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. According to this theory, fragments of a massive comet or asteroid, or perhaps an entire comet, struck the Earth around the time the Younger Dryas began. The evidence for this is scattered across the landscape of North America and beyond. A thin layer of sediment, rich in iridium and other elements common to extraterrestrial objects, lying in sedimentary records at precisely the boundary between the older, warm climate and the sudden return to Ice Age conditions. Some researchers have found evidence of shocked quartz, the kind of quartz that forms only under the intense pressures created by cosmic impacts. There are nanodiamonds, spherules, and charcoal deposits that suggest massive wildfires ignited across the continent. The impact, or impacts, for the theory suggests multiple fragments may have struck in rapid succession, would have been catastrophic beyond modern comprehension. Imagine the sky suddenly filled with fire, the atmosphere itself burning as fragments collided with the planet at speeds of many kilometers per second. The energy released would have been equivalent to thousands of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. Vast wildfires would have swept across the landscape, consuming forests and grasslands, filling the sky with soot and ash. The sun would have been obscured by this veil of particles, dimming the light that reached the surface, causing temperatures to plummet. But there is more to the story, something that connects directly to our mystery beneath the Sahara. As the great ice sheets that covered Canada and northern Europe began to collapse under the impact's thermal stress, as they fragmented and melted with unprecedented rapidity, the water contained within them, water that had been locked in ice for tens of thousands of years, began to flow across the landscape. Sea levels, which had already been rising as the climate warmed, rose dramatically and with sudden intensity. The ocean swelled, seeking new shorelines, inundating coastlines that human populations had inhabited. And beyond the simple rise in sea level, there would have been something even more violent, the possibility of massive tsunamis triggered by the impact itself, by underwater collapses, by the violent outflow of glacial meltwater into the Atlantic. Picture this moment. 12,000 years ago, the Atlantic Ocean, suddenly disturbed by catastrophic forces, begins to heave. Waves form, not the gentle rolling waves that we see on calm summer days, but mountains of water, some reaching heights of perhaps tens of meters, moving inland with terrible purpose. These waves would have swept across the coastal regions of North Africa, driven up river valleys, spreading inland across what is now the western edge of the Sahara Desert. The water would have carried with it the force of the entire ocean's fury, scouring the land, carving channels, moving sediment and rock in patterns that would remain visible to those who knew how to read them. And here, in the landscape of northwestern Mauritania, in the satellite images that have become available only in the last few decades, there is evidence that something extraordinary happened to the land. There are water erosion features, channels and valleys that cut through the landscape in patterns that suggest immense flows of water, flows far larger than any river that currently runs through the region could produce. When viewed from above by satellite, these patterns are unmistakable. They form dendritic networks, the branching patterns that flowing water creates as it splits and combines, seeking the path of least resistance across the terrain. Some researchers studying these satellite images have asked whether these features might be evidence of exactly such a cataclysmic flooding event. The Richat structure itself, that extraordinary geometric formation of concentric circles in the desert, shows signs of significant water erosion. The layers of rock have been weathered and worn. There are signs that water has moved through and across this formation, shaping it, smoothing it in places, carving it in others. Could this be evidence that the water that destroyed the ancient civilization of the Richat structure, if a civilization did exist there, was the same catastrophic inundation described in Plato's account? Could the rings that we see today be the remains of a place that was flooded, that was overwhelmed by water and sediment, that was eventually buried beneath layers of sand as the climate changed and the great deserts of the world expanded? Consider the timeline that Plato provides. He wrote that Atlantis had existed approximately 9,000 years before his own time. That would place the civilization roughly 11,600 years in the past, measured from our present day. The margin of error in such an ancient history is certainly substantial, but the coincidence is striking. Plato's timeline places the destruction of Atlantis at almost precisely the same moment in history as the Younger Dryas impact, the same moment when sea levels were rising most rapidly, when cataclysmic floods would have been reshaping the face of the earth. Whether this is historical memory or remarkable coincidence remains an open question, but the alignment is too precise to dismiss lightly. And what of the water itself? That most fundamental and patient of forces, the substance that makes all life possible and, when unleashed with violence, can unmake everything that life has built. Water has shaped every coastline on Earth. Water has carved the Grand Canyon. Water, moving slowly over millions of years, can accomplish anything, and water moving with sudden violence can accomplish more in days than seemingly impossible. Water evaporates from the oceans and falls as rain, nourishing the soil where civilizations grow. Water flows in rivers that become the arteries of human settlement, the highways of commerce and communication. But water also floods. Water also destroys. Water rises and covers, erases and buries. The ancient peoples understood water as something divine precisely because it contains this duality. It is both the source of life and the instrument of destruction. In the poetry of destruction, myths found across human cultures, water appears again and again. The flood is the destroyer, the reset, the moment when the old world is washed away and a new world can begin. Perhaps this is because floods are one of the few natural disasters so complete in their power, so total in their erasure of what came before, that they seem almost intentional, almost like the work of divine hands. When a flood passes through a city, it does not merely damage, it transforms. It carries away the familiar and deposits the strange. It mixes what was ordered and creates chaos. A person who experiences a flood, or who has heard stories of a flood from those who did, understands something primal about the powerlessness of human achievement before the forces of nature. And if such a flood, the flood that marked the end of the Younger Dryas, that swept across the ancient shorelines of Western Africa, that may have inundated the Richat Structure and the civilizations that dwelt there, if such a flood truly did occur, would it not be remembered? Would not the survivors carry the story in their memory, and in the stories they told their children and grandchildren? Oral traditions can preserve the essential truth of events across many generations, though the details may shift and transform, may become embellished or simplified, may be mixed with other stories until the original event becomes compressed into myth and legend. If you are still awake and enjoying this journey through ancient mysteries and deep time, please consider subscribing to The Calm Archive. A like truly does help more people find these videos when they cannot sleep, when they need the comfort of distant stories and gentle narration. When the world feels too loud and too bright and too immediate, there is something soothing about stepping back into history, into times so distant that the urgency of the present moment fades away. Now let us return to the mystery of Atlantis, to the question of whether those perfect circles in the desert might be the fading footprints of a civilization that once knew prosperity before the waters rose. The destruction described by Plato, sudden, complete, leaving nothing but mystery, is precisely what we might expect if the civilization at the Richat Structure had been obliterated by a cataclysmic flood. A sudden inundation would leave little trace. The waters would carry away bodies and artifacts alike. They would bury what remained beneath layers of sediment. Over centuries and millennia, the climate would change again. The desert would expand where once there had been lakes and rivers. The Sahara would reclaim the land, would cover whatever remained, would hide the ruins beneath dunes and stone, and eventually, all that would remain visible would be the geological features, the circles themselves, the water erosion channels, the subtle signs that something had happened here, something vast and terrible and absolute. In contemplating this scenario, we encounter the fundamental appeal of the Atlantis mystery. It is not merely the question of whether an ancient civilization existed in a place we did not expect to find it. It is deeper than that. It speaks to the possibility that human achievement and civilization can be erased so completely that it vanishes from the world, leaving only fragments that later peoples must puzzle over. It speaks to the contingency of all human endeavour, the way that history might have been entirely different, the way that what we consider important and permanent can be swept away in the course of a single night in the fury of water and stone. The Richat Structure remains indifferent and patient, as it has remained for countless millennia. Its rings continue to circle concentrically, visible from the heavens, a geometric perfection that seems almost impossible in its exactitude. And beneath its surface, in the rock and sediment and stone, there might lie evidence of the catastrophe that Plato described, evidence that is waiting for those with the knowledge and determination to unearth it, to read the story written in rock and erosion patterns, to determine whether the destruction of Atlantis was memory or myth, history or imagination given eternal form. The geological record preserves such catastrophes in ways that seem almost miraculous to those who learn to read it. A volcanic eruption leaves a thin layer of ash, a boundary line in the sediments that marks a precise moment in time, creating what scientists call a chronological marker, a moment when the world changed. An asteroid impact leaves iridium and shocked quartz. A flood leaves channels and deposits of sediment that came from far away, that could not have arrived by any ordinary process. And sometimes, if we are very fortunate and very careful, a catastrophe leaves behind artifacts, fragments of the civilization that was destroyed, objects that human hands shaped that can later be found and recognized and understood. It is not that we necessarily expect to find the ruins of Atlantis fully preserved, standing like a museum exhibit in the sand. 12,000 years is an enormously long span of time. Civilizations crumble and transform. Buildings are dismantled for their materials or collapse under their own weight. Artifacts are buried under sediment or scattered across vast distances by water and wind. But what we might hope to find, given a systematic excavation and study of the Richat Structure, are the signs of human habitation, the remnants of dwellings and tools, the evidence that people once lived in this place and then were driven away or killed by something catastrophic. The Richat Structure itself, when examined closely, shows characteristics that suggest water has played a major role in its formation and evolution. The rings are not uniformly spaced. They vary in their width and composition, suggesting different periods of erosion and deposition, different climate epochs when the water that shaped this place behaved differently. Some of the rings are harder than others, composed of different rock types that weather at different rates, creating the striking visual effect of perfectly separated concentric circles. This geological signature tells a story of complex environmental history, of periods when water was abundant and periods when the land was dry, of a region that was not always as arid as it is today. In fact, the Sahara itself has not always been the vast sea of sand that we know in modern times. The climate of the region has oscillated dramatically throughout human history. There have been periods that fall within the timeline of human civilization, when the Sahara was green, when lakes filled the depressions in the landscape, when rivers flowed from the high plateaus toward the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. These green Sahara phases correspond with periods of increased rainfall, driven by changes in Earth's orbital cycles, and the position of the monsoon systems that bring water northward from the tropics. And between these green phases are periods of aridity, times when the rains fail and the desert expands, when the lakes dry up and the rivers stop flowing. The Younger Dryas period, however, was not simply a climate fluctuation of the sort that the region had experienced before. It was something more extreme, more violent, more sudden. And the end of the Younger Dryas, when the climate returned to warmth and the ice sheets began their final retreat, was marked by an acceleration of melting, by a surge of water flowing from the northern ice sheets into the Atlantic. The Richat Structure lies inland, many hundreds of kilometers from the coast of the Atlantic, but water, when moving with sufficient force and volume, can travel vast distances across the land. It can flow up river valleys and across plains, carrying sediment and stone and anything else in its path. It can reshape landscapes and erase the evidence of human occupation. There is another element to consider as well, the possibility of underground reservoirs, of aquifers and springs that fed the land with water from beneath the surface. The Richat Structure is located in a region where there are indeed underground water systems, layers of rock and sediment that hold water deep beneath the surface. If a catastrophic flood event occurred, if the water table suddenly rose, if underground aquifers were overwhelmed and burst forth from springs and seeps, then the entire landscape could have become uninhabitable almost instantaneously. The very foundations of civilization would have been undermined. Literally, the ground upon which people built their homes and grew their crops would have become unstable, would have flooded from below, would have become a swamp or a lake where once there had been solid ground. Imagine the experience of the people who lived at the Richat Structure in those final days before the catastrophe. They had built their civilization in a place of remarkable natural resources. The rings of the Richat Structure itself would have provided shelter. The depressions between the rings could serve as areas of settlement, the harder rocks could be quarried for building material. The water that flowed across the landscape provided irrigation and sustenance. The surrounding plains were rich enough to support agriculture and herds of animals. It was a place of abundance, and abundance creates the conditions for civilization to flourish. People gathered, settlements grew, culture developed, knowledge accumulated. The future seemed assured. But then something changed. Perhaps the first signs were subtle. The water behaved differently. Springs that had always flowed began to fail, or to flow more abundantly. The air seemed different. The temperature fluctuated. Animals that had never been seen in the region appeared. Animals adapted to colder climates, fleeing the expanding ice sheets far to the north. The night sky looked strange, perhaps filled with unusual lights or meteor showers, the visible signs of cosmic debris falling toward Earth. The ground trembled. Springs erupted from new places. The water rose and did not stop rising. Within days, or perhaps weeks, what had been a place of civilization was transformed into a place of death and destruction. The survivors, if there were any, would have fled. They would have carried with them the memory of what had happened, the trauma of losing everything, the astonishment of watching the land itself betray them. They would have migrated to other regions, joining other peoples, their stories mixing with existing myths and legends. Across generations, the exact details of the catastrophe would blur and transform. The numbers would grow more extreme in the retelling. The causes would become confused with other disasters, other floods, other upheavals. But the essential truth, that a great civilization had existed and had been destroyed suddenly and completely by water and upheaval, might well persist in the oral traditions of affected peoples. And in time, one of these stories might have reached the ears of the ancient Greeks. It might have been carried by travelling merchants or refugees from Africa, by Phoenician sailors who traded along the African coast and had heard tales of the lost kingdom beneath the sand. It might have reached the learned men of Athens and been recorded by Plato, who wove it into his philosophical dialogues as a way of exploring the nature of hubris and the inevitable fall of civilizations that abandon virtue for wealth and power. What Plato presented as cautionary allegory might have been, at its core, a preserved memory of something that actually occurred, a memory distorted by time and the limits of human transmission, but still recognizable to those who could read the geological record of the land, the academic establishment, the geologists and archaeologists and historians who have devoted their careers to understanding the past, remains largely unconvinced by the proposition that the Richat Structure of Mauritania is the location of Plato's Atlantis. Their skepticism is not born from closed-mindedness or laziness, though critics of the mainstream archaeology sometimes suggest as much. Rather, it emerges from the rigorous application of scientific standards, from the principle that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and from the simple fact that after millennia of searching and theorizing, no one has yet produced the sort of material evidence that would satisfy the criteria of serious archaeological investigation. The geological consensus is clear and well established. The Richat structure is a natural formation, the result of geological processes operating over vast spans of time. The concentric circles are not the work of human engineers, but rather the product of differential erosion of rock layers with different hardness and resistance to weathering. The structure is composed of doleritic and granitic rocks that have been exposed and weathered in patterns that reveal the underlying geology. Various geological surveys and analyses have shown that the formation is consistent with natural processes, with water erosion, with changes in climate and rainfall, with the slow working of chemical and mechanical weathering on rock of varying composition. If the Richat structure once was home to a great civilization, we would expect to find evidence of human habitation. At least some of it should survive. We would expect to find pottery shards, which are extraordinarily durable and survive in the archaeological record for thousands of years. We would expect to find stone tools, flint artifacts, evidence of tool making. We would expect to find the remains of buildings, foundation stones, evidence of construction. We might hope to find metal objects, if the civilization had developed metallurgy, copper tools or gold or silver, objects that preserve well and can be accurately dated through various scientific techniques. We would expect to find human remains, bones that could be analysed and dated, that could tell us when people lived in this place and how they died. Yet despite the relative prominence of the Richat structure as a geographical oddity, despite its visibility on satellite imagery, and its accessibility through internet images that have made it known to millions of people interested in archaeology and history and mysteries, no such evidence has been systematically found and documented at the site. This is not to say that nothing is there. The Sahara is vast and difficult to explore, and the Richat Structure has been subjected to minimal archaeological investigation. But the absence of evidence is telling. In places where human civilizations have existed, evidence tends to accumulate. Even in harsh environments, even in deserts, archaeology has repeatedly shown us that signs of human presence persist. The remoteness of the Richat Structure and the region of northwestern Mauritania in which it is located presents enormous practical obstacles to serious archaeological research. Mauritania itself is a vast country with limited modern infrastructure, a relatively small population scattered across a huge landscape, and limited resources available for funding archaeological expeditions. The Richat Structure is located in the middle of the Sahara Desert, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest major city. Access requires four-wheel drive vehicles, careful navigation, and considerable supplies of food and water. The climate is extreme, temperatures that can exceed 50 degrees Celsius during the day and drop dramatically at night. There are no towns or villages nearby, no electricity or running water, no medical facilities within reasonable distance. An archaeological expedition to the Richat Structure must be largely self-sufficient, must bring with it everything necessary not only for conducting research, but for simply surviving in one of the harshest environments on Earth. These practical difficulties should not be underestimated in discussing why the Richat Structure has not been thoroughly excavated. Good archaeology is not hasty. It is not conducted in brief, ambitious expeditions. It requires long-term commitment, multiple seasons of work, careful mapping and documentation, the preservation of context, the understanding of not just what is found, but where it is found, and what surrounds it. To excavate properly at the Richat Structure would require establishing a research station in the region, training local workers, securing funding for years of work, and maintaining the political relationships and permissions necessary to conduct research on foreign soil. These are substantial barriers, and they help explain why much of the world's best-known and most thoroughly studied archaeological sites are located in regions with good infrastructure, stable governments, and established traditions of archaeological research. But there is another argument that carries considerable weight in academic discussions of Atlantis, an argument that applies not specifically to the Richat Structure, but to the entire question of whether Atlantis was real at all. Many scholars, perhaps most scholars in the field of Platonic studies and ancient history, believe that Plato invented Atlantis as a philosophical allegory. The story appears only in Plato's dialogues. It is mentioned nowhere else in ancient Greek literature. No other author of the period seems to have known of it or treated it as a historical fact. Plato lived in the 4th century BCE. Many centuries after the events he was describing would have supposedly occurred. The story is constructed in such a way that it serves Plato's philosophical arguments perfectly, illustrating his points about the nature of hubris, the inevitable decline of civilizations, the importance of virtue, and the consequences of abandoning justice in pursuit of material wealth. From this perspective, Atlantis is understood as a literary device, a thought experiment in dialogue form, similar to other imaginary scenarios that philosophers create to explore abstract ideas. The fact that the story is philosophically useful and didactically effective is taken as strong evidence that it was invented for that purpose rather than derived from historical events. If Plato had possessed a genuine historical account of a lost civilization, why would he situate it so conveniently in the distant past, make it correspond so perfectly to his current philosophical concerns, and never mention any sources for his information? The most parsimonious explanation, the one that requires the fewest additional assumptions, is that Plato made it up. This is a serious argument, and it deserves respect. It is the position held by the majority of professional scholars who have studied these questions carefully, yet it is not conclusive. Ancient peoples did preserve historical memories in story form, wove them into narratives that served multiple purposes simultaneously. A story could be both true and useful didactically. A story could preserve a real historical event while also illustrating philosophical principles. The absence of corroboration in other ancient Greek sources does not prove that something did not happen. It may simply mean that the knowledge was concentrated in certain places or certain families of people, that it was lost when certain libraries were destroyed or certain peoples were conquered. We know of historical events that are attested in only a single ancient source, and we believe them to be true because the source is generally reliable and the details are plausible. Nevertheless, the scholarly consensus remains deeply skeptical. To shift that consensus would require evidence, physical, archaeological, undeniable evidence that a sophisticated civilization existed at the Richat Structure during the relevant time period. That evidence has not yet been found, or, if it exists, has not yet been uncovered and studied. Yet the world is vast, and there are many locations where scholars have proposed that Atlantis might be located. The Richat Structure is merely one among many candidates, each with its own advocates and its own evidence. Perhaps the most famous alternative location is the island of Santorini in the Aegean Sea, the location of an ancient Minoan civilization that was catastrophically destroyed by a massive volcanic eruption around the year 1600 BCE. Santorini was indeed a circular island before the eruption, an eruption so powerful that it blew away most of the island, leaving behind a caldera, a depression in the landscape that filled with seawater. A thriving civilization did indeed exist there. It was indeed destroyed suddenly and catastrophically. A tsunami triggered by the eruption swept across the eastern Mediterranean, devastating coastal regions and island communities. The timing, the sudden destruction, the circular geography, the advanced civilization, all of these elements match aspects of Plato's description of Atlantis. The Minoan eruption has much to recommend it as a possible source for Plato's story. It occurred within recorded history, close enough to the present that knowledge of it might have been preserved in oral traditions. The Minoans had extensive trade networks and contact with Egypt and the Mediterranean cultures, so information about the eruption and its consequences might well have spread. It is conceivable that Plato, or someone before him, heard stories of the Minoan eruption and wove them into his narrative of Atlantis, shifting the location, changing the timeline, adapting the details to suit his philosophical purposes. Yet the Richat Structure has something that Santorini lacks. It matches Plato's specific measurements and geographical descriptions with startling exactitude. Plato described Atlantis as composed of concentric rings of land and water, alternating in a precise geometric pattern. Santorini is circular, yes, but it does not feature the pattern of concentric rings that Plato described. The Richat Structure, by contrast, features precisely that pattern, rings upon rings upon rings, in geometric perfection. Plato described Atlantis as lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which ancient peoples understood as the Strait of Gibraltar, the gateway to the Atlantic Ocean. Santorini is in the Mediterranean, well on the opposite side of the ancient world from the Atlantic. The Richat Structure is in Africa, relatively close geographically and geologically to the Atlantic. These are significant discrepancies between Plato's description and the Minoan hypothesis. Other proposed locations for Atlantis abound. Some scholars have suggested the Azores, islands in the Atlantic that have volcanic origins similar to Santorini. Others propose Doggerland, a landmass in what is now the North Sea, that was gradually inundated as sea levels rose after the last ice age. Still others have located Atlantis in the Caribbean, or in Malta, or in Spain, or even in Antarctica. Each proposal has its advocates and its arguments, though some are clearly more serious and supported by better evidence than others. A few proposed locations can be dismissed as pure speculation or fantasy, unsupported by any historical or geological reasoning. The problem with Atlantis research in the eyes of many serious scholars is precisely this proliferation of competing theories. When so many different locations and time periods and civilizations have been proposed as the real Atlantis, it becomes difficult to take any particular proposal seriously. The existence of so many rival theories, so many popular books making extravagant claims, so many amateur researchers pursuing fringe hypotheses, has led mainstream academia to dismiss the entire field as pseudo-archaeology, as the realm of amateurs and enthusiasts rather than serious scholarship. This is perhaps unfair. It conflates the behaviour of the worst practitioners of Atlantis research with the actual merits of the question itself. But it is understandable. When a field becomes crowded with wild claims and unfounded theories, serious researchers often prefer to distance themselves from it entirely. What would it actually take to prove or disprove the theory that Atlantis was located at the Richat Structure? The answer is straightforward: systematic archaeological excavation and investigation, conducted according to scientific standards with proper documentation and dating. Teams of archaeologists would need to conduct surface surveys to identify potential areas of human settlement. Geophysical surveys, techniques that use radar or other sensing methods to detect buried structures and artifacts without disturbing them, could help identify promising excavation sites. Once likely locations were identified, careful excavation using proper archaeological techniques would be necessary. Any artifacts found would need to be professionally documented, photographed, measured, and dated using scientific methods such as radiocarbon dating or thermoluminescence. If Atlantis civilization did exist at the Richat Structure, even 12,000 years after its destruction, we would expect to find some evidence of it. If we conducted such research and found nothing, no pottery, no tools, no artifacts, no signs of human habitation, then the theory would have to be abandoned. The burden of proof lies with the proponents of the theory. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the claim that an advanced ancient civilization existed at the Richat Structure and was destroyed by a cataclysmic flood 12,000 years ago is certainly extraordinary. If the Calm Archive has become part of your bedtime routine, I would be deeply grateful if you would consider sharing this video with someone who might need it tonight. Someone who lies awake in the darkness wrestling with anxious thoughts, or simply unable to find rest in the quiet hours. A share from you might reach someone who desperately needs the comfort of being transported to another time, another place, another world. And if you have not yet subscribed, I would be honoured if you would hit that subscribe button now, so you never miss a new video in our growing collection of stories and mysteries and meditative journeys through time. Now, where were we in our exploration of this enigmatic formation in the desert? This geometric puzzle that asks us to consider what is real and what is imagined in the distant past. The division between acceptance and skepticism, between mainstream archaeology and alternative theories, reflects deeper questions about how we decide what is true about the past. We have limited access to historical knowledge. We cannot travel backward in time to witness events directly. We can only read texts, examine artifacts, study geological evidence, and piece together narratives that are consistent with the evidence available to us. Different people, looking at the same evidence, sometimes reach different conclusions about what it means. One person sees in the Richat Structure a natural geological formation, and no more. Another person sees the same formation and wonders whether it might contain secrets waiting to be uncovered. Both perspectives are legitimate starting points for inquiry. The difference lies in how willing each of us is to follow the evidence wherever it leads, to maintain skepticism while remaining open to possibilities, to balance the healthy conservatism of established knowledge with the creative spark of genuine investigation. It is worth considering in this context the history of archaeology itself, the instances where mainstream scholars have dismissed theories that turned out to contain truth. When archaeologists first began to excavate Troy, the ancient city described in Homer's epics, many dismissed the belief that Troy was a real place. Yet Heinrich Schliemann, following Homer's descriptions and his own intuition about geography and history, found Troy. Or more precisely, he found a series of cities built upon the same site across many centuries, one of which appears to have been the Troy of ancient history. The discovery was controversial at the time. Some scholars argued that what Schliemann found was not the Troy of Homer, that he had misidentified the site, that he had imposed his expectations onto what he had found. But subsequent research has largely vindicated his basic claim. Troy was real, and archaeological excavation confirmed the historical basis of Homer's epic tales. Similarly, the existence of the Minoan civilization itself was unknown to the modern world until Sir Arthur Evans began excavations on Crete in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Before his work, the Minoans were myths, remnants of legends, characters in stories of the ancient Greeks. Evans' excavations revealed an advanced civilization that had indeed existed, with palaces and artwork and writing systems of their own. Again, there was skepticism, correction, and gradual acceptance. This pattern has repeated throughout the history of archaeology. Something that seems legendary or impossible turns out to have a basis in historical reality. These examples do not prove that Atlantis was real, or that it can be found at the Richat Structure. But they do illustrate a principle worth remembering as we contemplate old mysteries and unexplored places. The world is large. Our knowledge of the past is incomplete. Civilizations have existed that we have forgotten entirely, whose ruins lie buried under sand and sediment, whose stories have been lost or transmitted only through legends. It is possible, not certain but possible, that beneath the shifting sands of the Sahara, in the perfect geometric rings of the Eye of the Sahara, there lie the remains of a civilization that thrived in the distant past before being erased by catastrophe and time. What is certain is that the Sahara itself contains more hidden history than we have yet discovered. In recent decades, satellite imagery and remote sensing technology have revolutionized archaeology, allowing researchers to see beneath the sand without excavating, to map ancient cities and field systems and water management infrastructure that was invisible to previous generations of archaeologists. In the Sahara and its margins, researchers have used these technologies to identify previously unknown archaeological sites, to map the remains of ancient river systems and lake beds, to trace the roots of ancient trade networks. These discoveries are not about Atlantis or legendary civilizations. They're about real peoples and real cultures that thrived in the Sahara during the last 10,000 years, cultures whose existence was largely unknown or forgotten until modern satellite technology revealed their traces. One such people were the Garamantes, a civilization that flourished in what is now the Sahara, in the region of Libya, from approximately the 4th century BCE until the 4th century CE. For 1,000 years, the Garamanti maintained an advanced society in the Sahara, not despite the desert environment, but partly because of it. They developed sophisticated underground water systems, foggara, that tapped into deep aquifers and brought water to the surface, allowing agriculture in the midst of the desert. They built cities and maintained trade networks across the Sahara. They had a military and a government structure. They produced art and pottery that shows considerable sophistication, yet the Garamantes were largely forgotten by the modern world until the late 20th century, when archaeologists began to study them seriously. Some evidence of their civilization lay visible on the surface: ruins, artifacts, inscriptions. But much of it was hidden beneath the sand, revealed only by careful excavation, or, in more recent times, by satellite imagery that showed the patterns of their ancient field systems and urban settlements. The existence of the Garamantes demonstrates a crucial point. If a real, substantial civilization can thrive in the Sahara for 1,000 years and then be largely forgotten, buried beneath the sand, its very existence becoming obscure to later generations, then it is not unreasonable to suppose that even older civilizations might have existed in the region, their remains even more deeply buried, their stories even more thoroughly lost or transformed into legend. The Garamantes were documented by Greek and Roman writers, yet they were still forgotten until modern archaeology recovered knowledge of them. How much more easily could an even more ancient civilization, one that predated the existence of writing in the region, be completely lost to history? This is not proof of Atlantis, but it is a reminder that the world is stranger than we sometimes assume, that there are more hidden stories in the earth than our contemporary knowledge acknowledges, that beneath the visible and the known, there are always layers of the forgotten waiting to be rediscovered. The Richat Structure stands in the Sahara as a geometric puzzle, its rings perfectly visible from the sky, yet its secrets still largely unknown to us. We do not know everything about this place. We do not know everything about the history of human civilization or how it has moved and changed across the continents over the past 10,000 years. We know enough to be cautious, to require evidence, to resist wild speculation. But we would do well also to maintain a sense of humility about the limits of our knowledge, to recognize that there are genuine mysteries remaining, and to remain open to the possibility that someday, through careful archaeological investigation, we might discover that what we thought was purely legendary contained at its heart an echo of something real. For nearly 2,400 years, the story of Atlantis has captivated human imagination. From the moment Plato wrote of it in his dialogues, it has held a singular fascination, inspiring philosophers and scholars and dreamers to contemplate its meaning, to wonder whether it was real, to search for it in countless locations across the globe. Why should this particular story, a story of a lost island civilization, a story without substantial historical corroboration, a story that most serious scholars believe to be philosophical allegory, why should it endure so powerfully in human consciousness? The answer speaks to something deep in the human spirit, something fundamental to how we understand ourselves and our place in time. Every human culture seems to carry within it narratives of loss and catastrophe, stories of a golden age that has passed away, legends of great floods that reshaped the world and destroyed civilizations. The ancient Mesopotamians wrote of a great flood. The ancient Hebrew peoples preserved stories of a global deluge. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia, the Native Americans, the peoples of Polynesia, the cultures of India and China, all carried in their oral traditions accounts of floods that destroyed or transformed the world. Are these traditions independent inventions, stories that multiple cultures created separately to explain similar natural phenomena? Or are they echoes of actual catastrophic flooding events that occurred in prehistoric times and were so traumatic, so transformative, that memory of them persisted through millennia of oral transmission, gradually transforming from history into mythology? The flood myth appears so universally across human cultures that it seems unlikely to be pure coincidence. Floods are, after all, the most common natural disasters, the most frequent catastrophes that affect human populations. Rising water is indiscriminate and devastating. It destroys the works of human civilization regardless of how well built or carefully planned they might be. Water recognizes no boundaries, respects no structures. It flows around obstacles or through them, carries away what it touches, smooths and transforms everything in its path. For peoples living near rivers and coasts, floods would have been a recurring terror, something witnessed by individuals within a lifetime, something that shaped cultural memory. It is reasonable that such a common and devastating phenomenon would find its way into mythology and spiritual understanding. But perhaps the flood myth represents something even deeper. Perhaps it speaks to a primal fear that underlies human consciousness, the fear of loss, of destruction, of the erasure of everything we build and create. We live only a brief time. We construct buildings and communities and civilizations. We create art and literature and knowledge systems. We build cultures and pass them on to our children, hoping that what we have created will endure, will continue to exist after we are gone. Yet we know, somewhere in our deepest understanding, that nothing is permanent. Civilizations fall. Great cities become ruins. Languages are forgotten. The most sophisticated knowledge systems of one age become incomprehensible to the next. We are all merely waves in a river, briefly rising above the surface before falling back into the flow. The Atlantis legend speaks to this anxiety and this desire simultaneously. It tells of a civilization that achieved great things, that built cities and accumulated knowledge and created a sophisticated culture. But it also tells of destruction, of the sudden erasure of everything, of knowledge and achievement and human life falling back into the sea, into oblivion. In some ways, Atlantis is about the futility of human achievement. No matter how great we build, no matter how stable our civilization seems in the moment, we are always vulnerable to the forces of nature, always one catastrophe away from complete annihilation. Yet the persistence of the Atlantis story is not purely pessimistic. There is also something hopeful embedded in it. The story insists that Atlantis was real, that it actually existed, that even if it is now gone, even if it is forgotten and buried beneath the waves, it was not nothing. It mattered. It lived. The fact that we can still tell its story, even if we do not know where it was or exactly what it was, is a form of immortality. Memory persists. The human capacity to create stories and pass them on ensures that the essential truth of a civilization, even if the specific details are lost, can echo across millennia. There is another dimension to the appeal of Atlantis that has become increasingly significant in recent centuries, the idea that civilization is far older than conventional history has taught us. For many decades, mainstream archaeology operated under the assumption that complex civilization, cities, writing, organized governments, advanced knowledge, did not emerge until approximately 5,000 years ago with the rise of Sumer and Egypt. Anything that predated that was understood as prehistoric, a time when humans lived in small hunter-gatherer groups without the structures we associate with civilization. But in recent decades, this timeline has been progressively pushed backward, complicated, challenged. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, an archaeological site that dates to approximately 9,600 BCE, forced a re-examination of this chronology. Göbekli Tepe is a temple complex, a monumental stone structure that required sophisticated planning, social organization, and coordinated labor to construct. It demonstrates that people living in the early post-Ice Age period were capable of undertaking architectural projects of considerable ambition and complexity. The site predates agriculture. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were still living as hunter-gatherers, not settled farmers with surplus food production. Yet they managed to organize themselves sufficiently to build a temple that still impresses us with its sophistication and engineering. This discovery opened archaeologists' eyes to the possibility that complex civilization, in some form, might have existed earlier than previously believed. Since Göbekli Tepe, other discoveries have further extended the timeline. Evidence of organized settlement patterns, of trade networks, of symbolic expression and art-making keeps appearing in earlier and earlier periods. There is also the recognition that what we call civilization may have taken different forms in different places and times. We have been searching for civilization in the form it took in Mesopotamia and Egypt, cities, writing systems, monumental architecture. But perhaps advanced human societies took other forms. Perhaps there were civilizations based on different principles that left different archaeological signatures that might be more difficult for us to recognize and interpret. Perhaps the Sahara once hosted a civilization that did not use writing, or that used writing systems we cannot read, or that expressed its sophistication through means we have not yet learned to recognize as sophisticated. This expanding knowledge of the human past creates a space where the Atlantis question becomes more plausible. If civilization is older than we thought, if it emerged earlier and in more places than conventional wisdom suggested, then perhaps there were indeed advanced societies in locations we have not yet thoroughly explored. The Sahara is one of the least explored regions on Earth from an archaeological perspective. It is vast, arid, difficult to access. The sand covers vast areas. We know the basic outlines of Saharan history from historical texts and limited archaeological investigation, but we almost certainly do not know the whole story. There are surely ruins buried beneath the sand, civilizations that existed and left traces, yet have not been found or studied. The Richat Structure might be one of those places, a location where something important happened, where people lived and built and created culture. In fact, in recent decades, satellite imagery has revealed evidence of this hidden history. Modern remote sensing technology, the same technology that was originally developed for military and intelligence purposes, has been repurposed by archaeologists to explore landscape history. These satellite images and other remote sensing data have shown evidence of previously unknown ancient cities in the Sahara, evidence of sophisticated water management systems, of extensive agricultural zones that were once productive but are now covered by desert. There are patterns visible from the air that speak to human occupation and human reshaping of the landscape, evidence that the Sahara was not always as empty as it appears to be in recent history. The Richat Structure itself, when examined in the context of this expanded understanding of Saharan history, appears in a different light. It is not merely a geological oddity, a formation of idle curiosity that geologists study and tourism agencies use to attract visitors. It is a place with a history, even if that history is not yet fully understood. The precise rings, the geometric perfection, the evidence of water activity, these speak to a landscape that has been lived in, that has been important to human populations. Whether or not a sophisticated civilization existed there in the way Plato described Atlantis, the Richat Structure is undoubtedly connected to human history. It is a place where something happened. It is a place that warrants investigation, that holds secrets we have not yet uncovered. What unites the various flood myths, the various lost civilization legends, the persistent appeal of the Atlantis story, is a particular understanding of history and time. The recognition that vast epochs of time separate us from the past, that most of human history is invisible to us, that beneath the known world there are depths and layers of the unknown. We are privileged, in one sense, to live in the era of satellite imagery and archaeological science, to have tools that can reveal hidden aspects of the world. We can see the Richat Structure from above, can trace the contours of the land, can detect patterns that would be invisible to someone standing on the ground. We can date artifacts and analyze their composition. We can read ancient languages and decode ancient symbols. We have more tools for understanding the past than any previous generation of humans, and yet, for all these tools, mysteries remain. The past is not fully open to us. We can study it and probe it and attempt to understand it, but there will always be gaps in our knowledge, stories that are lost, evidence that has decayed or been destroyed or remains undiscovered beneath the earth. This is not a flaw in our knowledge, but rather a feature of the human condition. We're always trying to understand what came before us, and we are always limited in how much we can know. The Atlantis legend, in its persistence, reflects this eternal human situation. It is a story about the limits of knowledge, about the way that the past can vanish, about how civilization can be erased, and memory can be all that remains. The poetry of lost civilizations speaks to something in us that factual knowledge alone cannot quite reach. There is a particular melancholy in contemplating the works of human hands that have been erased by time, the cities that stood once and now stand no longer, the knowledge that was accumulated and then lost, the people who lived their entire lives in places we can no longer locate with certainty. A civilization is in some ways the ultimate expression of human effort. It represents not the work of a single generation or a single person, but the accumulated labour and knowledge of thousands of people working together across centuries. It represents the belief that something is worth building, worth maintaining, worth passing on to the future. When a civilization falls, all of that accumulated effort, all of that knowledge, all of that hope for the future, it falls with it. Yet this is not a cause only for sadness. There is also something beautiful in the idea that human beings, knowing as they must have known that death will come, knowing that the future is uncertain, still built. They still created. They still made art and wrote poetry and established laws and attempted to create justice. They did these things knowing that they would not personally see the fruit of their efforts mature. They did these things as an act of faith, as a way of participating in something larger than themselves, something that would continue after they were gone. And if that something fell, if it was erased, if it was forgotten, the fact that it existed at all was still meaningful. The fact that people tried, that they built, that they created meaning and beauty and order in the face of chaos, that matters eternally, regardless of how long the civilization lasted. This understanding extends to the Atlantis legend itself. Whether or not Atlantis was literally real, whether or not it can be found at the Richat Structure or Santorini or any other location in the world, the story serves a function in human consciousness. It reminds us of our contingency, our vulnerability, our dependence on forces much larger than ourselves. It reminds us that we are part of a vast and ancient story, that we are living in a moment of history just as every previous generation lived in their moment. It reminds us that the world is far stranger and more complex than our everyday experience suggests, that there are depths beneath the surface, that there are questions we do not yet know how to ask. The Sahara Desert, which covers an area approximately the size of the continental United States, remains vastly understudied. We know it as a desolate place, a sea of sand, a wasteland where human civilization struggles to exist. But this understanding is more recent than we might suppose. 10,000 years ago, the Sahara was green. It had lakes and rivers. It had abundant vegetation and animal life. Human populations lived there, hunted, gathered, and eventually began to farm. The transformation from green Sahara to desert happened not in a single moment, but across a long period of time, driven by subtle changes in climate and ocean currents. As the green Sahara dried, the populations living there had to adapt, had to move, had to find new places to live. But for thousands of years, civilization flourished in what is now desert. When we look at the Sahara today, we see primarily sand, rock, and emptiness. But when we look at the satellite imagery, when we use remote sensing technology to see beneath the surface, we discover what is hidden. Ancient river valleys, dried lake beds, the remains of settlements and field systems. Entire cities are being discovered buried beneath the sand, civilizations that flourished thousands of years ago and were then covered by the advancing desert. To stand at the Richat Structure and to contemplate that it might be one of these forgotten places, one of the locations where human civilization once flourished before being erased by time and climate change and natural catastrophe, this is to contemplate a particular kind of humility about human existence and human history. The Richat Structure itself is striking precisely because of its geometric perfection, because of the way it stands out in satellite imagery, because it seems to demand explanation. A geological formation can be beautiful in its own right, can be fascinating to study and understand. But when a natural formation is perfectly geometric, when it features concentric circles that might seem almost designed, the human mind naturally wonders, is this what it appears to be? Or could there be something more? Could human hands have shaped this? Could there be evidence of human civilization hidden within or beneath these rings? These questions are not irrational. They are the questions of human curiosity, the fundamental drive to understand and to explore that has characterized our species since we first began to wonder about the world around us. And so we return, again and again, to the Richat Structure. We return to the question of Atlantis. We return to the idea that there might be civilizations beneath the sand, knowledge that was lost, stories that have been forgotten. We return to the wonder and the mystery, the sense that the world contains more than we can currently explain, more than we have yet understood. This is not certainty, this is not proof, but it is the beginning of inquiry, the spark that ignites investigation, the question that leads us to dig deeper, to search further, to refuse to accept easy answers. The Sahara, vast and patient, keeps its secrets. It waits. It has swallowed civilizations and preserved their traces in the stone and sand. It has hidden cities and roads and monuments. It has conserved evidence that archaeologists are only now beginning to discover, using technology that previous generations could not have imagined. And the Richat Structure, the Eye of the Sahara, continues its slow existence, its rings visible from space, its geometry perfect, its mysteries intact. What lies beneath the surface? What stories are encoded in the layers of rock? What knowledge? What achievement? What beauty? Did it once exist here, in this place, before the desert claimed it? These questions remain open. These mysteries remain mysteries. And in a world that often seems too certain of itself, too quick to claim that it understands everything, there is something valuable in maintaining a space for genuine mystery, for questions that do not yet have answers, for places and times that remain hidden from our understanding, waiting patiently for the day when human curiosity and human technology might catch up to them. Thank you for spending your evening with the Calm Archive, for allowing me to guide you through these mysteries and these meditations on ancient history and lost worlds. If this has helped you relax tonight, if you found some peace or comfort in imagining distant places and distant times, I would be deeply grateful if you would subscribe to this channel so you never miss a new video. I upload every day, and there is always something new to drift off to, whether it is a historical mystery like this one, or a nature documentary, or a meditation on art or science or philosophy. Every video is crafted with care to help you find rest and stillness in the darkness. Tell me in the comments, do you think Atlantis was real? Do you believe that somewhere beneath the sand of the Sahara or the waves of the Atlantic, there might be evidence of a lost civilization waiting to be discovered? Or do you prefer to understand Atlantis as a myth, a story that reveals truth through imagination rather than through historical fact? Your thoughts matter, and I read the comments and I consider them as I plan future videos. Now, as we drift deeper into mystery, let us return one final time to that extraordinary formation in the desert, to the Eye of the Sahara, and contemplate what it might be hiding beneath its rings of stone. Imagine, for a moment, standing in the Sahara Desert at the edge of the Richat Structure at the moment when the sun is touching the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson and deep purple. The wind, which has been moving across the dunes all day, begins to shift as the temperature drops, begins to carry a different quality of air, a cooling breeze that brings relief from the heat that has dominated the landscape since dawn. You are standing at the centre, or perhaps at the edge of these perfect rings, looking outward across the formation, tracing with your eyes the concentric circles that rise and fall in the landscape, each ring a different shade as the light catches them at different angles. The sand beneath your feet is warm, still holding the heat of the day, but you can feel it beginning to release, beginning to surrender the warmth that it absorbed from the sun. The desert is vast around you, stretching in all directions toward a horizon that seems impossibly distant, and in that vastness, you feel simultaneously alone and connected to everything, alone in the physical sense but not in spirit, not in imagination. Think of what Plato knew about this place, or what he claimed to know. He wrote 2,400 years ago, and his words have echoed through centuries, carrying the image of a lost civilization, a place of wonder and beauty and sophistication that was erased. He could not have known that someday satellite imagery would reveal this formation, that someday people would see from the sky what could never be fully understood from the ground. He could not have known that his words would guide people across millennia to look in particular places for evidence of the past. Yet his words did exactly that. The power of a story, the power of an image in words, the power of asking a question that has no certain answer. These things persist. These things shape human attention and human effort across centuries. This is what we mean when we speak of the immortality of literature. Not that the specific facts are eternal, but that the questions, the mysteries, the sense of wonder that a story awakens can persist even as empires rise and fall, even as the world changes almost beyond recognition. The wind carries sand grains, tiny particles that have travelled, perhaps, from mountains hundreds of kilometres away. The sand that moves beneath your feet, the sand that creates the dunes and shapes the landscape, is not inert material. It is the product of geological time, of rock broken down by water and wind across millions of years. Some of the sand particles beneath your feet might once have been part of mountains in the high plateaus to the south. Some might have flowed in ancient rivers. Some might have been the floor of a lake, some part of a riverbed when water flowed abundantly here. And some, if the theory of a civilization at the Richat Structure is correct, might once have been part of buildings, part of artifacts, part of structures created by human hands and shaped by human intention. The Richat Structure rises and falls in patterns that create a natural amphitheatre of stone and earth. If a civilization had existed here, if people had lived among these rings, they would have used them, would have built upon them, would have utilised the natural features of the landscape. The harder rings would have been perfect for structures. The softer areas would have been easier to excavate for wells or for dwellings. The geometry of the formation would have suggested patterns that human architects might have followed, incorporating the natural rings into the design of the city. And if such a city had existed, if it had thrived here for a period of time, what would that city have felt like? What would it have been like to walk these same rings as someone living in that civilization, to see them not as a mystery, but as the familiar ground of home, the experience of daily life, the routine of agriculture and commerce, the maintenance of government and justice, the creation of art and beauty? All of these things would have occurred here, in this place, if the civilization existed. The people would have looked at these same rings, would have understood them as part of their world. The wind would have blown then as it blows now, the sun would have heated the earth, the stars would have shone above at night, and the stars above the Sahara at night are extraordinary. Far from the light pollution of cities, far from the ambient glow of human civilization, the night sky reveals itself in its fullness. The Milky Way stretches across the heavens, a river of light, a visible reminder of the vastness of the universe, of our position in a cosmos so immense that the human mind struggles to comprehend it. If the civilization of Atlantis existed at the Richat Structure, the people who lived there would have known this sky. They would have watched these same stars, would have named them, would have created myths and stories and navigation systems based on them. They would have understood the constellations, would have used the stars to mark the passing of seasons, would have incorporated the stars into their religion and philosophy. The stars themselves are ancient beyond measure, are the same stars that have watched over human civilization since the very beginning, that have observed the rise and fall of empires, that have remained constant while everything beneath them has changed. This is a humbling thought, that the stars that would have illuminated the civilization of Atlantis, if it existed, are the same stars we see today, that we can look up at night and see the same light that illuminated the eyes of ancient peoples. The closing of the day in the desert is gradual and then sudden. The sun descends toward the horizon, light begins to fade, the temperature drops with increasing rapidity. What was blinding midday heat becomes comfortable warmth, becomes cool, becomes cold. The human body, which has been struggling against the heat, begins to relax, begins to find comfort as the temperature approaches the ideal range for human rest. There is something almost magical about the cooling of the desert, about the way that the landscape transforms as darkness falls. The colours deepen. The geometry of the Richat Structure becomes less visible, but seems simultaneously more mysterious, less clear in detail but stronger in overall form. A person standing at the edge of the rings might feel drawn inward, might feel the formation calling them deeper, might imagine what it would be like to walk into those rings, to descend into the spaces between them, to explore the darkness that gathers there as the light fades. The comfort of blankets, of layers of fabric between oneself and the cooling night air, of the shelter provided by walls or tents or any covering that protects against the temperature and the wind. These things take on profound importance in the desert night. To be warm beneath blankets while the desert cools around you is to experience a particular form of security and peace. It is to create a small zone of warmth and protection in a landscape that is indifferent to human comfort, that will take the warmth from an unprepared human body within hours if conditions are sufficiently extreme. The creation of this comfort, this refuge from the elements, is one of humanity's oldest and most important accomplishments. Before civilization, before cities and writing and complex government, there was the simple human need to stay warm, to be protected from the elements, and across millennia the methods have not changed so much. Still, we wrap ourselves in cloth. Still, we create shelter. Still, we huddle against the darkness and the cold, finding peace and rest in the maintenance of simple physical comfort. And as the night deepens, as the desert breathes slowly in the darkness, releasing the heat that it absorbed during the day, the Sahara transforms into a place of particular stillness. The wind that has been constant becomes sporadic. The endless sound of sand being moved by air gives way to periods of near absolute silence. The kind of silence that exists only far from human civilization, only in places where the noise of traffic and cities and machinery has never penetrated. In this silence, a person's own breathing becomes audible. The heartbeat, usually inaudible unless one is paying particular attention, becomes perceptible. The sound of blood moving through veins, the subtle sounds of the body functioning, these become apparent in the silence of the desert night. It is a different silence from the silence of indoors, of a quiet room in a city. This is the silence of emptiness, of space, of a landscape that has few sounds to produce and fewer ears to hear them. It is a silence that is not threatening but rather comforting, a silence that allows thought to settle, that creates space for rest and peace. The Richat structure keeps its secrets, as it has kept them for millions of years if it is merely a geological formation, or for thousands of years if it is the location of a lost civilization. The rings continue to circle concentrically. The stone and earth remain patient, waiting. Waiting for what? For archaeologists to excavate? For technologies to be developed that might reveal what lies beneath the surface? For the future to catch up with the mysteries of the past? Or simply waiting without expectation, existing without purpose, being what it is and nothing more? The beauty of the Richat structure lies partly in this uncertainty, in the fact that we do not fully know what it is. It can be many things simultaneously. It can be a natural geological formation, and also a place of profound mystery. It can be merely Earth's story of how it reshapes itself, and also the possible location of humanity's greatest lost story. The truth of the Richat structure is capacious enough to hold multiple meanings, multiple narratives, multiple ways of understanding. As sleep begins to approach, as your eyes grow heavy and your breathing deepens and slows, you might imagine yourself there at the Richat structure, standing or lying at the edge of those rings, watching the darkness gather and the stars emerge one by one as the twilight fades into night. You might imagine the warmth of blankets wrapped around you, the comfort of knowing that you are protected, that you can rest here in safety. The wind carries the sound of its movement through the landscape, a sound that is almost like the sound of breathing, almost like the sound of the desert itself resting, almost like the sound of time moving slowly through the vast emptiness. Your eyes close. Your breathing becomes more regular, becomes the rhythm of rest, becomes the rhythm of sleep approaching. The world around you continues. The desert continues to cool. The stars continue to shine. The structure continues to hold its rings in geometric perfection. But you're no longer fully aware of these things. You're drifting, falling deeper, passing from the world of wakefulness into the world of dreams. In the dreams that come as sleep takes hold, perhaps you walk among the rings of the Richat structure. Perhaps you see it as it might have been, if the civilization existed. You see buildings of stone and clay, you see people moving about their lives, you see the water that once flowed here, you see the place as it was. Or perhaps you see it as it truly is, a mystery that has not been solved, a question that remains open, a place that waits for the future to discover whatever it truly contains. Or perhaps you see something else entirely, something that your particular mind has conjured from the raw materials of the story you have heard, from the images that have been presented to you, from your own imagination and your own hopes and your own sense of wonder. The dreams that come in the deep darkness carry the stories we tell ourselves, carry the mysteries that captivate us, carry the sense that the world contains more than what is visible and known. The desert breathes slowly, the sand shifts incrementally, the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patient patterns, and somewhere beneath the rings of the Richat structure, buried beneath layers of earth and time, there might be evidence of what came before, evidence of a civilization that lived and built and created and then fell, or evidence of geological processes alone, of the earth reshaping itself without human presence. The Richat structure does not yield its secrets easily. It does not announce itself as man-made or natural. It does not declare its truth. It remains, as all great mysteries remain, both present and hidden, visible and concealed, inviting us to wonder while refusing to provide certainty. Think of the water that once flowed there, if it flowed there at all. Water that rose from underground springs, or water that fell as rain during the green Sahara periods when the climate was different. Think of how water moves, how it shapes, how it creates channels and erosion patterns. Water is patient. Water does not hurry. Over time, water accomplishes everything. It softens the hardest stone. It creates canyons and valleys. It transports sediment across continents. It builds deltas where it meets the ocean. And when it floods, when it comes with sudden violence, it reshapes landscapes in the course of days. Water is simultaneously gentle and terrible, creative and destructive, the source of all life and the instrument of all destruction. If the civilization at the Richat structure was destroyed by water, by the cataclysmic floods of the Younger Dryas, then water is perhaps the ultimate mythic destroyer, the force that erases, that covers, that buries and preserves simultaneously. Water carries things away but also preserves them, often in remarkable condition, in sediment layers that protect artifacts from decay. Water is thus a paradox. It destroys civilizations but also preserves the record of those civilizations for future generations to discover and study. The same water that ended the civilization would have preserved evidence of its existence. The water that swept across the landscape would have buried buildings and artifacts beneath layers of sediment that, over millennia, would have compacted into stone, would have created geological layers that archaeologists can now read like pages in a book. The layers of Earth are a history book if we know how to read them. Each stratum, each layer of rock or sediment represents a period of time. The oldest layers are at the bottom, the newest at the top. Embedded within the layers are artifacts, fossils, evidence of past climates and environments. A skilled geologist or archaeologist can examine the layers and, with the help of dating techniques, determine when each layer was formed, what the environment was like, what organisms lived in it. If excavations were ever conducted at the Richat structure, if archaeologists were to dig carefully through the layers, they might find evidence of habitation in the middle layers, dating to the period when such a civilization would have existed. Below that would be evidence of the catastrophic flooding, of the sudden change in conditions that destroyed the civilization. Above that would be evidence of the gradual return to desert conditions as the climate changed again after the Younger Dryas. But this excavation has not yet occurred. The Richat structure remains largely unexcavated, largely unexplored by archaeologists. It exists as a satellite image, a point of curiosity on maps, a geographical formation that draws the occasional tourist. It exists in the dreams of those who believe it might be Atlantis. It exists in the imaginations of people who, like you, listen to stories about it in the quiet darkness before sleep. And in this state of non-excavation, in this state of mystery, it remains open. It could be anything. The interpretation is not yet fixed. The story is not yet written in stone. It remains a question rather than an answer. And questions, of course, are often more interesting than answers. Questions allow for possibility. Questions invite wonder. Answers close doors. Questions open them. And in that space of uncertainty, in that place where mystery dwells, there is room for rest, for the release of the need to know and understand everything, for the surrender to the unknown and the unknowable. The world is vaster than our knowledge. History is deeper than our understanding. The past holds secrets that we may never uncover, mysteries that may persist as mysteries until the end of time, and perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the value of mysteries lies not in their solution, but in their existence, in their capacity to awaken wonder, to encourage curiosity, to remind us that there is always more to learn, always more to discover, always something new waiting just beyond the horizon of our current knowledge. Consider the luxury of not knowing. In our daily lives, we're constantly seeking information, seeking certainty, seeking to reduce uncertainty and surprise. We want to know where we stand, what to expect, what the future will bring. But there is a cost to this perpetual need for certainty. There is a heaviness in always knowing, a lack of wonder, a sense that the world has been fully catalogued and understood, that there are no more mysteries, no more frontiers, no more places where the unknown still dwells. The Atlantis mystery, the question of the Richat Structure, the vast unexplored regions of the Sahara. These things preserve in the world a space for genuine not knowing, for the experience of standing before a mystery and being willing to admit that we do not know the answer. The Richat Structure awaits, the Atlantis mystery persists, the desert keeps its counsel, and you, beloved wanderer of this story, you drift now into the peace of sleep, carrying with you the image of those perfect rings in the sand, carrying with you the question of what lies beneath, carrying with you the sense of vast time and ancient mysteries and the endless human search for the past. The eye of the Sahara closes now. As your eyes close, the day releases its grip on the world. Darkness deepens. The night becomes absolute. Your breathing slows. Your heartbeat settles. The weight of your body upon the bed or the couch or wherever you rest, this weight becomes heavier, becomes more substantial, becomes a kind of anchor holding you to the earth, even as your mind drifts upward into the realm of dreams and sleep. The boundary between waking and sleeping grows thin. The world of consciousness and the world of dreams begin to merge. And in that darkness, in that peace, in that final release of wakefulness into sleep, the world's mysteries rest alongside you, patient and eternal, waiting for morning just as you wait for morning, just as everything waits for morning. The desert, the rings, the stones, the secrets, and the slow, steady turning of the earth beneath the infinite sky. The Richat Structure, the eye of the Sahara, holds its silence. It holds its geometry. It holds whatever truths it contains. It waits, as all ancient places wait, for the future, for the day when its secrets might be revealed, for the moment when human curiosity and human effort might finally penetrate the mysteries that surround it. But tonight, for now, it rests in darkness. And so do you. Rest well, wanderer. Sleep deeply. Dream of ancient cities and geometric rings and water flowing across deserts. Dream of what was and what might have been. Dream of the vastness of the earth and the long reach of human memory. And know that when you wake, the mystery will still be waiting. The Richat Structure will still be there. The Atlantis question will remain open. The past will continue to whisper its secrets to those who know how to listen. But for now there is only sleep and rest, and the gentle darkness that holds us all.